This is my 2016 review of the open source firewall pfSense. We'll start with why pfSense. Built on a very solid pre-BSD platform. If you don't know how solid BSD is, look it up. It's a great platform to build things on. It's open source. Code can be audited. That is huge to me and a lot of other people, especially people in security. We've seen some backdoors in some of the other firewalls, and it's closed source, and we didn't discover the backdoors till we realized they were there for a few years and we don't know who put them there. I like when the code can be audited. That gives us a little bit of confidence that we think there's something wrong, we can look at the source. It's very configurable and customizable, can completely be managed from the web interface. Very much so. You do have full command line access, nothing hidden, enterprise features, VPN CARP and QoS, third-party plugin support, and commercial incident support available, so you can pay them for support on their website. They have a really inexpensive for incident support, just in case you're going, I'm not sure if I can figure this out, but I will admit, for the years I've been using it, I've never used their support forum, actually incident support, but I have went through the support forums and answered questions for people and had a couple myself. But overall, this has been really easy to use and everything's fairly intuitive. All right. We're going to boot it off the CD here, and when you boot off the CD, we're going to go through that install process. There is another install process if you want to use solid state, for example, like a flash drive to install it on. You simply image it. The flash drive imaging means you start later because it skips all this install part where it asks you hard drive questions and things like that, because it just images directly to the flash drive and you set it to bootable and you're good to go. So when you boot, it wants to, if you leave it all alone and don't touch anything, it'll boot right into the firewall mode, do some default settings, and work as a firewall running off of a live CD. And you can configure it from there. I prefer to do an install and put it all on the hard drive and set it all up so you can have persistence and save it. It also offers a recovery mode, which is kind of cool too. So if you want to start recovering right from the CD, it'll ask you for the XML file or start looking on the hard drive to recover it, and you can start reassembling it. We're actually hitting I for launching the installer. By default, everything's perfectly fine. If you have some unusual hardware, maybe you need to change that if you're outside the US and you want a different key map settings. If not, run down to accept the settings. I just do the quick and easy install, but this does support fancy things like RAID and extra hard drives with different partitioning. If you wanted to put multiple drives in it for some incredible logging and you say, I don't want it on one drive or I want to do something unusual, it does support that. We're going to use a quick and easy install. I haven't really found much use for the other ones. Put a bigger hard drive in, it has plenty of space for the logs. Also, rescue config.xml. It's got a rescue option, or you can just do the install from your old previous config. Great. If the hard drive dies, you just grab your last backup file, put the XML file, and it goes right back to where it was. Easy install automatically without asking questions. That's pretty much true. It doesn't really ask much. It just erases, sets up the partitions, and goes. You watched a little spinny bar go across, and then it's done. Now, this does support both the standard and embedded kernel for no VGA console. So if you wanted to run this on some of those embedded devices that have no video out at all, you can choose that. And so a lot of them have serial out, so it'll redirect the console right to the serial. Pretty neat. Reboot and run. So eject the CD or bootable USB or however you installed this. And it boots up, comes to this. Now, this is where you start setting up your network card so you can get into the web interface. Now, you can, if you know which network card it jumped to, it's got EM0 and EM1, which are both Intel cards on this one. And if you know which one it is, just go right on there and type in the IP address 192.168.1.24. You can go right to the wizard. But if you're not sure which one's which and you want to start labeling them, you can go through and set up the interface. First question is whether or not you want to set the VLANs up. I said no. For the demonstration purposes, we're not doing any VLANs. I don't have any VLAN hardware set up for my virtualization right now. Then it has the auto interface for auto detection. This is kind of neat. So you unplug all the network cables and you press A, and then you connect which interface you want to be the WAN in this case. And when you plug it in and press enter, it detects which one was up. So first you unplug all the network cables, just plug in the one you need, and it detects which one, and then you can say, hey, that's which one's the LAN. If you're using one of those dual or even quad network cards, this becomes really handy, so you're not sure, does it start as 0 at the bottom or 0 at the top? And this is how you get that labeling figured out by plugging each one in. You can do it afterwards just by unplugging and plugging. You look in the dashboard and seeing which ones go out, but that's more playing. This is easier, and right from the beginning you can put the labels on here before you really get going with this. It's admin and pfSense. Once you go to the wizard, you just type in the IP address you set for the LAN, which I left everything at default, 192.168.1.1. and you run through the wizard to configure it. First thing it asks you is feel the power of a pfSense Gold subscription. I think they're still like $100 a year for subscription. I subscribe to it. They give you a nice newsletter. They have I think it's a monthly online Google Hangout you can go to, and you get some of the latest news and things like that on there. And you help support the project, so I support the project is really why I give them the money. I do read the newsletter though too. I like to see if there's any new updates and what's up and coming on there. All right, we're going to call this pfSense demo and leave it at default as local domain, but you can, of course, match this to however you want your network. You can override primary and secondary DNS. Yes, you can add more later. You can put plenty more DNS servers in later. By default, it has NTP Server set up and automatically pulls and sets the time for you, and you set the time zone. When you're configuring the WAN, we're going to leave it at DHCP, but it does have the other options for static, PPOE, and PPTP. So if you're using, and I don't see this much more, maybe it's in the US, they quit using it a while ago. At least I think. I have just in our area, I never see them anymore, but the PPOE, it does support that. Maybe it's more used elsewhere, but they left it all in here. So if you still are using that type of connection, you have that as an option. It does support PPTP, point-to-point tunneling protocol. That's built into the WAN side. So if you have a WAN that you connect to and then connect for the internet with a PPTP, it has that authentication on there. Now down here we've got block bogon networks. Now that is, so if you have it double netted, you may or may not want to use this and uncheck those. By default, you're assuming the WAN is going to be a WAN public IP address, but if this is behind yet another firewall because you're inside of another network that you're protecting, you may or may not want to block these because you're going to say, okay, you have a private address space on the WAN side. And here's where it comes back. It's still the default 192.168.1.1, but then you can change it here to whatever you have, a large 10-dot network. You can change the subnet, and it's got all the options in there. You can't leave it at pfSense, but you could change it back to pfSense. It does not have a default password after you run through the wizard, which I really like. That you're forced to do something. You have to put a password in. If you choose to do a weak password, it will let you. It does not have any restrictions. You could make it just password if you wanted to. Highly don't recommend it. Good news is, by default, the web interface will only be accessible by default on the LAN side over HTTPS. It does not open up the firewall without you adding the rule to open up on the other side. Once it's done, you click reload, it reboots, and you're done. It reminds you again if you'd like to purchase the services offered by pfSense or just continue on to the web configuration. Now, when you first log in, you're presented with the dashboard. The dashboard is customizable. You can move and drag around these little pieces here if you wanted to move them around. You can also hit the little plus here and add more options. And as you add options, you can do things like real-time traffic graphs. You can put the service statuses. It will show all the configured interfaces. I actually have more interfaces, but they're not configured, so they don't show up here. And it has green for being up, and it turns red if you unplug the network cable. Once you're done playing with this interface, if you don't click save and you change page, it will just drop them off and go back to default. So once you add whatever you want to add here, click the save settings. And here's some of the available widgets, CARP status, dynamic DNS, gateway, geometry, mirror status. That's for some of the, if you had it set up for multiple WAN for failover, it can let you know whether or not one of those has failed. It has an option to put a picture, an RSS feed, list of services, smart status. So if you're using a hard drive in this, not a flash USB, either an SSD hard drive or something that supports smart monitoring, that is an option. It will tell you whether or not the smart has passed or not, which is kind of nice. It lets you know if the hard drive is failing. System menu options. So by default, it wants to set up everything HTTPS. You can say, don't do that, don't use that certificate, come up with something else. It will go back to HTTP. You can even load your own SSL certificate if you have internal ones that you'd rather use than the self-generated ones. There's a whole menu we'll get to for that. Max number of processes, as in how many people can log in. So if you have a lot of people logging in, because it does have its own user manager that allows different people at the same time to be logged into the firewall. Anti-lockout, all this is all fine. DNS rebinding check. Now this is if you are using it with double NAT, you may want to uncheck some of those because if you come through the outside double natting in, you'll get a weird error that it thinks it's a rebinding attack. That is because you're coming through and it's expecting the WAN to be public, and that comes back to the block bogons. So you can disable that check on the firewall. That way you can log in through a double NAT. And I've seen a few people have it set up where they have a pfSense firewall, but they let the Comcast still handle the WAN side. Don't know why you do that, but then you have a WAN with a privately assigned address on this, and if you don't check that box, you can't remotely administer it because it looks at it as a rebinding attack. Click the link, it tells you what a rebinding attack is. And here's a few other options. You can enable SSH. I definitely do that. I like to have SSH access just internally. I don't have it enabled externally, but it comes in handy sometimes if I like to look at some of the command line stuff. Oh, there's also at the bottom, even though I didn't load specifically a serial terminal, it does have the option to enable it later. So you could say make the console output go to a serial terminal because this sits in a rack and I only have serial access. Firewall NAT, everything here I pretty much leave at default, but it does have different tuning and adaptive options and things you can play with here. By default, everything works perfectly fine out of the box. There's not anything you really need to tinker with here. The only thing I do tinker with comes down to this pure NAT. I do enable that. By default, it's turned off, and I don't know why. What that allows you to do is go through and put in the settings for the firewall so the system can work inside and outside the same. For example, we have cameras configured. I can put in the DNS entry in my phone for the cameras. It works inside and outside, even though that's on an internal network. And what it's doing is it's doing NAT reflection with pure NAT. This option allows you to do other things like, for example, we're running OwnCloud. Now my laptop, when it's here, connects to my DNS entry for OwnCloud, even though it's physically internal into the building. And when I leave the building, the same DNS rule works. So it realizes that I'm in the building and actually redirects it for you with each NAT rule and say, oh yeah, you're in the building, but we'll just redirect this DNS to this local server as opposed to going out and back in. Definitely a great feature. I don't know why it's not enabled by default. You can override this in case you have a NAT rule that you build that you don't want to work internally. I don't really know why I don't want one to work internally. I like when they work all the same. You can play with state timeouts and readjust everything from default from TCP opening, establish, closing, fin wait, TCP close, UDP timeouts, IPMP timeouts. You can control a lot of details. I'm impressed that they put all this in the web interface. So if you say, you know, I don't like what the TCP defaults are in BSD, I want to modify or monkey with them, you can. System Certificate Authority Manager. This is where you can load your own CA certificates. You can do your own CA revocation based on whether or not you say, you know what, I have this, but I want it to expire because I issued a personal VPN certificate for one particular user and I want it to expire. That is where you set all this up. It has its own self-signed web configuration certificate that it creates that doesn't expire till 2021, so by then you either have to recreate it or replace the firewall, hopefully after that many years, but then it should run for 5 or 6 years without a problem. You can just hit create a new one. All you'll get is a certificate expired error, and then you can rebuild the certificate through the auto creation tool that it has and change it to some incredible date like 2030. I have on mine a self-signed certificate that I created and put it in here, and I use this for my VPN. So I have some of the details obscured, but it's kind of neat. You can do this, and you can assign those to each user. That way each user that logs in through the VPN can have their own, and then you can go to the revocation and revocate that when you're doing the VPN. Kind of a cool feature. Enable firmware upload. Now it does have an auto update, but if you say I don't want to use the auto update and I want to come up with my own because I've decided to fork the project, it's got that as an option. So you can load your own firmware on here. It's completely open. It will still do a full backup of the previous. So if you customize the firmware in some way because you want something different, you can do that and then upload it here. The auto update looks at their site and decides when there's a new version and lets you do it. Now, it does not automatically upgrade. You still have to click the button to say upgrade it, but I've never had a problem with that. And to restore full backup is pretty cool because when you do a full backup, it doesn't just back up the incremental. It creates an entire image of the system. That way, if the update does not go right, you can recover that whole update and it re-puts the system in exactly the same state. Of all the updates I've done to all the clients and we've had this deployed, I have had 0 failures, and I've been doing them remotely. I've got such confidence in this product. I mean, some of these have been deployed for 2 or 3 years, and I've just remoted in on a weekend, hit upgrade, logged in a few minutes later, confirmed the upgrade worked and all the firewall rules are working, and no problems at all. This is also where you can change a URL. So they allow you to create your own server and own updates. So if you're running a whole farm of these, maybe in a corporate environment, and you say, I want to do my own updates and I want to set them up on my own server, they have that option. You can override the settings of getting it from pfSense directly and roll your own updates and have it check a URL for those new updates. They have all that in there, and you can go to their website for some instructions on how to do that. Right now, there are no backups available, so there's not an option on there. Another cool thing about the full backups is you can tell it not to restore the config file, so you can restore it and then still rewrite it back to a different config. Now here's where you can add some more DNS settings. This is under the general setup. And if you're running multiple gateways, you can put a different DNS server on different gateways. So if you have multiple WAN and multiple gateways because you have redundancy, you can say, hey, use these DNS servers on this gateway and these DNS servers on that gateway. Then you got the checkboxes, whether or not you want to allow the DNS to be overridden by the DHCP or WAN side. And you could change the time zone here if you wanted to. Also, there's a theme option at the bottom, which is kind of cool. There's a handful of different themes. I'm leaving it the default one just for consistency, but you can write your own theme. They have some cool ones built in that make it look different. They even have some that don't even have drop-down menus because you want everything in flat HTML where everything's visible. That's an option in here too. If you have an older browser and you want to be able to access it, that's one way to do it. Synchronized states, pfSync. This is pretty cool. If you have multiple firewalls for redundancy and you're using CARP, but you go, I want to make sure the rules cascade over, including every configuration I do, that is an option. So you can go through here and change all that, which is pretty neat. So you can set up a sync server, you can set up the sync username, and then you choose what you want to sync. You can just sync everything, sync some of the details. Pretty cool feature for high availability. And you can granularly control this. You don't have to sync everything. You can sync sections of it instead. So you can uncheck some of these boxes like I want this and this to work, but I don't want this synced up on the other server for whatever reason. They do give you fine-grained control. Here's the system gateways that it installs by default. You can create, and I just did this for demonstration, you can say, hey, reroute this network to that network. So anything looking for this, go to that. As many as you want. You can add custom routing in there. That way, if you have some really unusual routing or unusual setups in your office that you go, this needs to redirect to this segment of the network, not a problem. They got you covered. You can add that in there. Gateway priority and grouping. This is pretty cool too. You set up the link priority for failover or load balancing. So multiple links to the same priority will balance connections until the link priority has been exhausted. So you can create all your gateways and tie them all together in here. And you have as many gateways as you can have network cards. So you can really build a whole lot in here. And I got different triggering methods of like, does it drop the link or does it have packet loss or high latency? So you can set some parameters of when you should roll over to the other gateway and create this gateway group. The gateway grouping is also pretty cool. It is an easy way to manage them. So you can even have 2 network cards going for one gateway group and 2 network cards going to another gateway group. That way you can have multiple redundancies and multiple failovers. So you can get real in-depth on this, which is pretty cool. And right here's where you set the triggering level. Systems Manager, by default, it's admin. I'd always recommend taking the admin. I don't delete it. I just disable the admin so I can't log in after I've created my own admin user. You get very granular control over the users. You don't have to give a user admin access. For example, if you're using the user just for VPN, you want to use a local database built in here. Say I want to add a VPN user, you can add them and not have any permission. So they actually can't log into the firewall, they can only log into the VPN. You can set up the group so you can have someone only manage a certain section. You can just give them full admin rights, or you can say they can only go through and edit the firewall rules, and you can create a group for that under the groups. And once you do, it tells you at the bottom what the effective privileges are of this user. By default, there are no implicit privileges, so creating a user does not give them privileges. This is also where you add the per user certificates that will show up in here. So you can say this user has this certificate that will work with the VPN. That way you can have password authentication combined with the system certificate combined with a user certificate. So you have every way of security to really lock down your VPN. Here's some of the system privilege lists. As you can see, it lets you go through and customize all kinds of different sections on here. There's also an option, maybe if you have a new systems guy in training, that you go user config, deny config write, and that's going to give them only read-only access. Great for showing newbies, going, hey, you can look at the system and tell me what you may want changed or want done, but you can't write to it, so I'm not worried about you breaking things. Now the good news is this does track changes per user. So if a firewall rule has been changed, it tells you who created the rule and who last changed the rule. So make sure you don't give everyone the admin, create different usernames. That way when the firewall rule gets broke, you're like, who broke it? You can look at the rule and it tells you who last changed it. Also, when you load packages that we'll get to, some of the packages add permission options. That way you can say you have permission to the firewall, and if you're an admin, you get permission to everything, but then you can granularly control whether or not they have access to certain packages that are loaded. And I created one for DarkStat. I said access to this. They can access the web GUI of the DarkStat system, so pretty cool. Databases. By default, there's a local database for all the users, but there's options. If you have an LDAP authentication in your office and you want to use that, no problem. You can use LDAP or Radius. You can convert this over so it uses that to authenticate. So maybe they're just part of your larger Active Directory or LDAP system. You can tie them all together through here, so you don't have to use a local database in there. Also supports Radius authentication. Let's talk about packages. A great feature of pfSense is the fact that there are third-party packages available for it. Lots of them. Whole lots of them. More than I have time to talk about. Scroll down here. It scrolls pretty far. I'm going to cover a couple of my favorite ones. Now to install a package, you click the little plus button next to the package name, and it wants to know if you want to install it. Now it's not grabbing it from the package maintainer's site. It's grabbing it from pfSense for your matching version. And it also tells you whether or not it's compatible. So they tell you the latest version that this was tested with. If you're running a really outdated version of pfSense, I don't know why you would, it will tell you that this package was not been tested with your old of a version of pfSense. So definitely keep your system up to date. Once it's done, it grabs the file, installs it, and adds the menu. This can be a little bit of a mystery, as you may not know what menu it added under. Did it add under status? Is it a service? Or is it a diagnostic? So you have to sometimes look to figure out where it is. Make the assumption by what you're loading, and you can figure that out. Some of the favorite packages that I load. DarkStat being one of them. Definitely a neat tool for giving you aggregate information. IFTop, network management. It's very the same thing, giving you aggregate information per IP address so you can see who's using your bandwidth, and it works from the command line. So I like that when I SSH in. It gives you a nice visual in real time. It draws and then curses and draws little bar graphs going up and down to show you which IP address is sucking up bandwidth. OpenVPN Client Export Utility. I love this tool. This tool lets you export a user completely from the VPN into an executable. So it has the VPN installer, it embeds the certificates, it embeds the IP address of the WAN, and all the settings. So even if you customize your VPN and use a different port than normal, all that information follows right into a single executable that will run on a Windows computer. So if you have those road warriors, you copy it to a USB, you pop it in their computer, you double click it, they can next their yes right in and done. Then it just needs to put in the username and password when prompted and done. The certificates are taken care of, they're imported. It does have an option to export for Android. It's got an extra network for Linux. Linux doesn't have an auto installer, but it gives you basically the instructions and sets and certificates and lets you download it. So definitely great. It does support Mac and still supports Windows XP. So if you, for some reason, want to allow an XP person to VPN in, you have some special case use for that, it's still supported. And Snort. We're going to talk about Snort a little in depth. Snort's great utility for intrusion detection, sometimes to a fault, but definitely if you want to log intrusions and see who's attacking your firewall, Snort is awesome. So we're going to jump over here to DarkStat. It's under the Diagnostics menu. By default, it's not enabled. You enable it, pick the interface you want it to listen on, and by default, it's going to listen on the LAN. There's a couple different options to customize in here. And this updates and scrolls across in real time, showing your bandwidth usage over the last 60 seconds, over the last 24 hours, and 31 days. This is kind of cool, so you can, if you have a client that calls you and go, man, I'm trying to figure out who's using up all my bandwidth. First, you can say, is there a bandwidth problem? Is there spikes in this? You know, is someone trying to download something? And then you can start sorting by volume each computer, what they're doing, and figuring out where your data is being pulled from. And here's iftop. We SSH'd in and ran iftop from the command line, and you can then watch these little bars represent. I've only got my one computer on here, but you got these bars over here when I'm barely pulling bandwidth, and then they spike up because I was running a speed test just to watch the bars spike up and see that 55.8 megs and 11.2, and you know, it's pretty cool. It breaks down the details for you, but I like the visual of this too. Snort. So Snort is the intrusion detection system of choice for a lot of companies. It does all kinds of fun stuff, and we're going to just go over the basics and turn on blocking. So by default, you're greeted with interface with none set up. So you click the little plus button, and we're going to do it on the WAN interface. You can look for things attacking your internal network by putting it on the WAN interface, and you can track some of that. So you can see, for example, if you're running an open Wi-Fi and you just want to see who does what when they get on your network, that can be a fun experiment that Snort makes pretty easy to do, because you just point it at the LAN and away you go. I check these boxes, send alerts to the log system, log auth, block offenders, kill states, which means when it thinks there's an attack, just kill it, and then which IP to block. By default, I just block both IPs that come in. The rest of the settings I leave at default. That seems to work fine, but there are some tweaking and performance enhancing options you can do. And you can also look up the command lines for Snort and then add different command line arguments. They just give you some white space at the bottom to drop them in. So you don't have to go to the command line to add some special configuration. You go, you know, I like to do it exactly like this. No problem. Just add those parameters here and it'll add this to this interface. And if you have multiple WAN interfaces, you can set up multiple Snorts for different WAN interfaces. That might be a fun experiment if you have two different ISPs and see how the attacks may differ that are on two different segments of the network. You can then check the boxes here and here for the Snort community rules, emerging threats, and open app ID detectors. So these are some of the different rules that you got in there. Now, when you check the boxes by default, and if you want to sign up for the paid rules, you can. I'm just using the free ones here. But when you check the boxes, that doesn't automatically mean they're going to update. The update interval is by default at 12 hours, which is fine. And I have at the very bottom here, it's set up to remove blocked hosts in 15 minutes. The problem I have run into is when you are removing blocked hosts, it may not remove them fast enough, and I've gotten attacked from an Amazon cloud server. Someone scanned me, it tripped it, and then we couldn't access a lot of things on that segment of the network. And we'll get to how you can instantly clear those or just wait 15 minutes. And once you have the rules checked, we're going to go to update the rules. So all the rules are checked here, and we're just going to hit update, and it's going to update all the rules. Once you're done, go back over here to the Snort interface. If it's not enabled, you'll see a little red X. You click the red X and you'll see a green icon. That means it's enabled. Now, I don't have Barnyard 2 enabled. That's another option in there so you can gather more data in more detail. I'm not going to really cover that, but it's got all the full features of Snort. So if you want to turn this on to not just be an intrusion detection, but be almost like a honeypot where you really collect a lot of information and then redirect it for logging, they have that option so you can get really advanced in here. And I jumped over to my firewall, and so we can look at what traffic threats look like. There wasn't any threats coming from inside my network, so it was kind of boring to look at. So here's the attacks that are just constantly going against there. It logs which IP address in my WAN. I have 5 of them, and it tells which ones are getting attacked at what time and gives me some information. You can click the little blue eye on either side of them. Of course, it's no fun clicking on the right side. Those are my IP addresses, but we look at the public IP addresses here on the left, and it gives you the resolving address, if there is. If not, I'll say there's nothing to resolve. There's no reverse DNS for this. Over here, you can add this to the suppress list, and that means don't bother me with this notice anymore. Maybe you have just someone who creates a lot of noise, the same IP address keeps banging away, and you're like, you can block them permanently. You can just say, don't add this to my logs. It just creates static or noise. This host was blocked due to what they were trying to do, which was sniff my SNMP, and it's in the block table, so it's got an extra X. If I just want to remove them from block, I just check that box and they are removed from the block table, or wait 15 minutes and they fall off. Here's the blocked IPs. You can hit the clear button over here and clear them all at once, or they will automatically fall off in 15 minutes and they'll just disappear. You can create custom pass lists. So if you say no matter what this IP tries to do, go ahead and let them pass and don't put them on the block list and ignore it. Not a problem. And you pick which gateway, DNS, virtual IPs, or VPN, just let them pass. Not a problem. Suppress list lets you customize kind of the same thing. So you can create suppression for certain things and gives you some customization here. These are the automatically downloaded emerging compromised IP list. This is blocks of IPs that get added. You can create your own list. You can edit the existing list to see what's in there. This is a very detailed, so you can update the rules and configure them very detailed, so you can change each little config rule and edit them. I leave this all at default, but if you wanted to do more customization, there are different options for that in the SID management. I don't know why this isn't checked by default, but auto log management, do check that to make sure your logs don't overrun. It should auto delete them, but then all this with the bottom was grayed out. You don't get some fine grained controls till you do that, and you can set how many days for retention on that. And it does support part of the pfSync. So you check all the pfSync boxes, you sync up your firewall for failover, but you then can also say, I want Snort to synchronize. So that way when there's a failure in the firewall, it just jumps over to the other Snort. This is how we set up interfaces. Now, by default, we had the LAN and WAN set up, and I have an available network, PCN0, just an unconfigured extra network card that was in there. You don't have to configure these. A lot of the boxes you may buy have extra network cards in them and just configure what you need, but that allows you for future going, hey, I want to create this separate network, and then you can go back in here and add one whenever you want. You hit the plus. By default, it calls it OPT1, just the same way it calls it WAN and LAN, so option 1. All these are renameable. You don't even have to call the WAN WAN. You can rename it to whatever you want at the top whenever you click on these to edit the interfaces. Interface groups allow you to create rules that apply to multiple interfaces. This is kind of cool. That way if you go, all right, I'm building a firewall rule, but I have an interface group, so I want this rule to apply both sides, you then can just apply it to the group instead of having to create 2 rules. So if you have 3 WAN for failover, redundancy, and even dial-up backup types, you can then apply a group rule to it. That way the same rules apply. That way when you're applying it to the WAN group rule. This is the VLAN editing, pretty straightforward. Pick the parent interface, pick the VLAN, add the description, add as many as you want up to 4,094. PPP interfaces. This is for setting up a failover, not as multiple WAN, but failover to cellular data as an option. So if you have it set up so you need a cellular data provider as your backup, that is a feature supported in here. I imagine quite a few different are supported. I don't have a list, but a quick Google search will do it. It also has different country support, so it doesn't just work here in the US or overseas. GRE as an option, so you can configure GRE tunneling in here if you're using that. Bridging. This is kind of fun. You can take this and take a group of network cards in there and use it as a bridge, as in a switch. So if you tie them all together, you can then set the protocols and set some of the options and kind of use it as a smart switch with some routing function or no routing function, and just group some of the interfaces together to make it work as a switch. Like I said, kind of a novel feature that you can do that. Link aggregation settings allows bonding and fault tolerance, so this is kind of cool. So if you wanted to do link bonding, that's an option. And this is where you go into some of the details when you're setting up the lag. You can set it up for failover, FEC, LACP, load balancing, or round robin, where it just distributes the different options on there. So if you had multiple parent WAN interfaces and you wanted to distribute the workload of the users and the bandwidth, you can then use the round robin to distribute it across multiple interfaces. Now let's look at the actual configuration of the interfaces. So here's the LAN interface. Don't uncheck enable, because you can disable and lock yourself right out of the firewall. Good news is you can just jump to the command line on the console and fix that. So that you can name it here, put it as LAN. You can change the name if you just want to call it internal network or however you want. You can configure the IPv6 configuration or just turn it off here. Then on the WAN, you set it to DHCP, by default DHCP 6 for that, for the configuration. You can spoof the MAC address if you'd like, modify the MTU, modify advanced settings like speed and duplex. You can do this on the LAN side as well. You can also, if you change it to static, the menus change and you type in the static address. This is not where you add a range of addresses. You only add the first. Like if I have 5 IP addresses, I add my first one in here, and later we set up the aliases for the other IP addresses. So the opt1 interface by default is disabled that we added earlier, and you click the enable and all the same options come right back up. And it lets you set up your own IP address for this, so you can even build it outside of another network. Remember though, if you build a secondary interface and you build it outside the network, that does not automatically give it access to the other network without a firewall rule. And you'll see when we get to the firewall, each interface gets its own rule set. Now, if you're using this and you have a wireless card inside of there, it does support wireless as well. You can set the MAC address to the wireless like all the others, speed options, set up different ranges for the interface, and all these other menus show up because it recognizes it as a network card, so you can then change all the different options such as the channel, antenna settings, distance settings, regulatory settings, so you may change country codes as long as the device has support for some of those. You can go through and modify the access point for different options. Gives you a pretty decent amount of tuning features, and then you can change the SSID and the wireless standards, or you can go back to using WEP if you want. Then for the WPA, I put in some really good password, and you can set the WPA1 to WPA2, the pre-shared key types, the pairwise, the AES type, the authentication type, whether or not you want to use AES or one of the other older authentication protocols, key rotation, master, key regeneration. Like I said, they give you a lot of detail in here if you want to tweak with it. Let's jump into the firewall. So first thing we'll look at is the virtual IP addresses. This is where you add the different aliased IPs. And if you're familiar with how Linux, the Unix world works, you can alias an interface. Now you can actually alias more than just the WAN. You can alias the LAN interface as well. So if you wanted to create virtual IPs on the LAN interface for different rules that you're building that you want have different gateway settings for, this is where you could do that on the LAN side or the WAN side, where you have 5 IP addresses that you get static from your provider, and this is where you'd put those other 4 from the one you set for the WAN. And right here's the different options on there, whether or not you want it to be an IP alias, a proxy ARP, other, or CARP. It says the interface, what the single address is, and different options if there's a VAHD group, if there is a advertising frequency that you need. Some of those options, if you're setting up for CARP and ARP, are in there. And once you're done, you have the alias set up. And I set it up as a second IP on the WAN. Now this is inside my network for this demonstration purposes, so it's 3.170 is the WAN, so I added 3.6 because it was available, and now I can build rules or anything based on that. Let's look at port forwarding. So by default, it has no rules, of course, and then you click the plus to build your rules. You can disable this rule. You can RDR. Now here's the Firewall NAT port forwarding edit. By default, you can disable this rule. It's enabled by default, but you can create a rule that you later disable, and that's the toggle for that. What interface this is going to be applied to, WAN, or we could use the pull down and choose different information on there. So don't apply it to the WAN, don't port forward through this. And then the destination is how it's landing. Does it land at the primary WAN address, or does it land at one of the aliases we created? And I'm going to go over how we do each of those. Destination, you've got the little pull downs, so you can choose different options, HTTP, HTTPS, RDP, or just type in the IP address or port numbers right there. Now when you're putting the port numbers in, you'll notice that there's a start, a from, and to, but there's only a 2 here. So if we start this at 80 to 100, we only have to put 80 for the redirected target port, and it assumes the rest after that. But if you put 80 and 100 here and started this one at 100, it'll go to 100 to 120. That way you don't really have to try and assign all the different address ranges. You just have to start and finish, and then you just put the start wherever you're redirecting, because it doesn't have to redirect to the same port number. Usually you do, but it has an option on there. Redirected target IP is the internal IP behind the NAT that does this, that you want it to land on. Then you can put a description in, so you can say, okay, this is a description of what this is. This is a rule for RDP, whatever you're setting up. Now the protocol options are extensive. You have TCP, UDP, TCP, UDP, ICPMP, GRE, IGMP, PIM, and OSPF, and AH, which I'm not sure what AH stands for right now. I can't remember. But so you can definitely customize the protocols that are coming through there. I haven't had to use GRE in a long time, but like for example, PPTP, the unsecure older Microsoft VPN used GRE, so you used to have to forward a GRE port internal to get that to work behind a firewall. So you do have those options. So if you need some advanced routing done for your NATing, that is supported. Source is where you pick where it's coming from. By default, any, but you can create a firewall rule and a NAT rule that says only this IP can pass through, and then you would set a single host or alias and put it in there, or maybe you say only if they're coming over this or that, PPOE, L2P, LAN, or option. So you can create this as from your option 1 network into your LAN network and create a rule specifically for that, but then not have it touched there, and you would have to change it at the top so it's not landing on the WAN. Destination WAN address. So it can land on the primary WAN address or your secondary IP addresses that you set up. And for mine, I have 5 of them in there. So when I'm creating a rule, I choose which one of my 5 static IPs that I want it to land on. Then from here, you can set destination port ranges, like I was saying earlier. So I said 5143, and then I set it at 5134. I transpose the number, but no big deal. It's this for demonstration purposes. Some traffic is what I call as a description, and then here's the NAT reflection. Now it says use system default right here and add associated filter rule. Those are important because I wanted it to use the system default, which is turning the NAT reflection on, and the associated filter rule means create a firewall rule at the same time. I've never understood why some firewalls don't have that as an option. I've got to create a NAT rule and then go back to 2 menus deep and create a firewall rule that matches the NAT rule. This has the option just to link the rules and say, we'll just create them all at once. If you don't want to, you can tell it not to. So you can create your firewall rules unlinked to your NAT rules, but why would you? You have to create the rules. Why not create them at the same time? If you wanted to override the NAT reflection, that's an option too. If you said, I don't want NAT reflection to work on this particular one, I can say do not work. So this is those other options in there. Apply changes. No firewall becomes active until the changes are applied. So the rule is pending. You click apply changes. And you will notice over here that it's got an option for a linked rule. So you know it's not just a rule, it's a linked rule. There's a corresponding firewall rule that allows this traffic to happen, and we'll show how that works. So you click apply changes, it doesn't take but a second, and applies, and that firewall rule has become active. Now we went jump back in here to edit, and it's easy to edit the rule. So you can go, okay, I want to change something on it, like I want it to go to this as opposed to the WAN. So you just go back, check the pull down, and check it. And then you'll see created and updated by. I'm not using 2 users right now, but this is where I was telling you how you can track what the users are doing. And here's the option to click to view the filter rule that goes corresponding with this. And there's the users at the bottom. Now you can see the destination address has changed from WAN to the destination IP alias that we set, and it shows the alias in here. And same thing, I had to click apply changes. I just skipped that part. So here is the firewall rule that corresponds with it. It automatically copied whatever description you put in, which was some 5143 traffic, and it added the word NAT in there to let you know that it's a linked rule and that it copied over from that description. And when you edit the description, it does change over here on the firewall rule side. Now here's when we try to edit the firewall rule. The by default action is pass, but a lot of the other options are all grayed out, such as the port ranges and things like that. That is because you have to click back on where it says view the NAT rule to go back to the actual editing part. Because this is a linked rule built from the NAT, it allows only a limited amount of editing for this rule. The default is perfectly fine because it creates a rule, and by default it creates a pass for it, but then you can get into fine-grained filtering of this rule with some of the other options. Here is the advanced options. There is all kinds of things. For example, you can use OS fingerprinting, which is reasonably accurate. We know it's not perfect, but then you could say this firewall rule should only allow a machine matching an Amiga OS firewall type, or you only want AOL users, for example. And you could pull on this list. You could even say, you know, implicitly allow only people on Android to access my firewall if the OS fingerprint matches. So I thought that was kind of cool. Obviously, if people can spoof OS fingerprint, it's not the most secure way of security, but it's kind of novel that it lets you do that. Then you can scroll down. There's all kinds of advanced options to play with: unique number of source hosts, number of established TCP connections, maximum state entries per host. You can fine tune to say this rule has real restrictions on it that only allow these things to occur. You can also play with the TCP flags and say only allow if these flags come through. You can play with the state types of whether or not this state should be synced with the pfSync. So when your failover happens, should this rule not only persist, but should the states persist via pfSync? Then you've got a few other different gateway rules, in and out rules, and ACQ and layer 7 rules. What that's for is some of your bandwidth shaping. So you can apply a traffic shaping rule queue to a firewall rule. So the firewall can then go, okay, I want to restrict the bandwidth on this particular rule to limit this. So kind of a neat feature that it lets you get that advanced, and it does the in and out. So when you're choosing the rules, you can be bi-directional. They can't pull any more bandwidth than this, or they can't pull out any. So it goes both ways when you create the rules. And right here's where the option 1 interface, I added a rule. I said LAN and option wide open, which all I did was by default add open to everything. So if you create the rule, you just say source, destination, port, everything, any, and it will then allow traffic to go on there. Now this also supports queuing. You can then create a rule and then say, I want to pass all the traffic from my option 1 interface to my LAN interface, but then I also wanted to only limit the bandwidth between these two interfaces for this. So kind of a neat way you can do that, so you can actually limit the traffic between sections. So it's not even going out to limit the internet traffic, you're limiting the traffic between the two interfaces, so you can have internal and control the amount of saturation or bandwidth that any one user on that side takes up. It has a scheduling option here, and this is weird to me. It does not have like a persistent, like do this every Friday or do this every Sunday. You have to implicitly allow times, and it only goes out 1 year in advance, and once those times pass, they expire. This is the scheduling button that was in the firewall, and this lets you schedule a firewall rule. So you can say on April 28th turn this firewall rule on at 2 o'clock, and then at 3 o'clock turn the firewall rule off. Kind of neat if you have something planned in advance that you want to open a firewall up for and do it. I don't really come up with other uses for this. It's kind of an odd thing. Let's get into traffic shaping. Now the traffic shaping is pretty advanced and complicated and a little hard to figure out unless you use the wizard. The wizard makes it really easy to set up and definitely the way to do it. So first is it wants to know number of WAN interfaces that you're using. Now the wizard had a couple options. One of them is if you have like multiple WAN, multiple LAN, and you really want to go into fine grain. I choose the more basic wizard. It's just the first traffic shaping wizard, and it says how many WAN connections. By default, 1. I only have 1 on this. Now this is an important part. Know your bandwidth so it divides it up properly. And if you don't set this right, it's not going to understand how to divide it up because you're dividing in percentages. So you need to first start out with how fast is your upload, how fast is your download. So we have currently a 5 up, 50 down, so we set this up. Fun trivia I learned though, if you have a 100 megabit connection, but you have bandwidth that exceeds that, and you put that in here, you'll get a strange error that unable to set state, I think is what it says. And it turns out I was testing one with an old network card, playing with something, and you can't set it to exceed the bandwidth of the network card. So if it's a 100 megabit network card and you set the bandwidth higher than 100 megabit can handle, you'll get a weird error, and this will fail because it's smart enough to know that the interface is not capable of doing it, but it's too dumb to tell you that's the error, and you end up Googling it for a few minutes. So here is the enable prioritize voice over IP traffic, which I do want because I'm using VoIP phones, and this is one of my #1 uses with the traffic shaper, is creating some priority in there. You can also put the upstream SIP server in there if you know the provider, like Ring Central or Vonage is actually one of the default providers listed in here, so you can put them in and it automatically realizes, okay, you have those phones, and then you can set however much bandwidth you want to allocate, look up the type of phone you're using, look up how much bandwidth they recommend for calls, multiply that times number of phone, and put the number in here. Really simple to do. You can create a penalty box that you can really limit the bandwidth of 1. Now this is where the aliases can come into, because you can put in the address or alias of it. So if you create an alias group of IP addresses on your LAN, and you can say make the bandwidth really slow for them, that's where you can use alias and you don't have to type in each address. Traffic Shaping Wizard peer-to-peer networking, which is kind of cool. You can say enable it and lower all the priority of peer-to-peer traffic. And I've tested this. It works okay. I think peer-to-peer traffic just creates too much noise. I was testing this at home as whether or not gaming or Netflix would have any lag if I was torrenting something at the same time. And it did a good job, but not an awesome job. It still seemed to slow Netflix down a little bit. But when I turned it off, Netflix became unusable, of course, if I was torrenting. So it does work. I maybe have to tweak it a little more because of maybe I allocated too much bandwidth. I also think the firewall, I have a really inexpensive one at home, and I think it may have just gotten a little overwhelmed. I seen the CPU was spiking a bit, trying to group together all this traffic from torrenting because it's such a noisy protocol. It also has gaming options, so you can raise the priority of all your games. It's got a lot of them built in there. I thought it was kind of cool. You know, it's got Call of Duty, Battlefield, Wii console, Xbox console. And of course, you can customize these. It goes down. There's quite a list in here. Now, this is where you can get in there and set your priority. So you can enable it and you can go, okay, I want RDP to be a higher priority no matter what, or maybe some of the messenger protocols to be lower. You can also take VPN traffic and raise some of the VPN traffic for IPSEC, for example, down here at the bottom. And it's got some multimedia streaming options, so if it can detect the traffic type. The problem is, as more and more things go SSL, it's becoming harder to detect traffic type as things are mostly using HTTPS as a transport. Once you're done, you get this cool little setup that I don't know, QAC default and VoIP. These are where you can get into the details. This is the names it creates on them, and they are all editable. So if you wanted to fine tune and tweak and you understood how the traffic shaping system worked in detail, it does have options to go and climb in and do it if you understand what all these mean. So it kind of gives you some basic descriptions. It does let you tweak it. You can also just rerun the wizard and adjust something. So you go, I added 2 more phones. I want to update that. And I'm not sure if I just want to change this bandwidth setting here. You can just go run the wizard again, and it remembers some of your settings and put them back in and just change it from 600 to 800 kilobits, for example, to add a little more bandwidth. You can also watch the queues and see how much is in each queue for each one of the methods. So if you're trying to solve a problem with jitter or voice problems with VoIP, it lets you get in here and get in detail on that. Captive portal. This is great if you're a coffee shop or a hotel that you want to have users authenticate but not just get on. So you can set up the captive portal where they can agree to terms and conditions or whatever you want on there. That way they can't just get on the internet, they get an address, they get assigned, and then they go, oh, I got to say yes or agree or have something in there. It doesn't just support that page. You get to customize the page and customize the options in here. You can also use authentication protocols such as PAP, MSCHAP, MSCHAP2, or just use the local user manager where people have to have a password, and you can just create a dummy user that says like guest and guest that does not have access to log into the firewall because you assign them the rules, but then assign them in the user manager, and then that is the login they have to use. That way you can just change the password and everyone can use the same one or use different ones so you can start tracking who's online. It does have per bandwidth user restrictions. Without going and setting up any traffic queuing, you can say, hey, these users only get this much bandwidth when they hit the authentication, and then you can put in bypasses for certain, for example, by MAC address, that these MAC addresses don't at all have to go through the captive portal. It's got all the different options for the accounting, the radius server if you want to use that type of authentication, and you can redirect them to HTTPS. It has some of the identifier options. By default, if you do HTTPS, it will have the self-signed certificate that pfSense created, or you can override that and change it again. This is also where you have the basics of what it should look like. You can copy and paste this, then customize your own HTML screen for whatever you want, and maybe upload an image and say these are the login page, logout page, and how it should look when they hit it. And there's a file manager that lets you upload different images that you would embed and just use image tags for your authentication page. Then you can go through and add MAC addresses. Kind of cool. If you're from that computer logged in, it's got an option just to copy your MAC address in there and create a pass-through. You just click the copy MAC and say this MAC address can always pass and no worries. Then you can set per MAC address each bandwidth restriction on there. Allowed host names. Not the most secure way to do it, but yes, you can just say if it has the name Tom Spooter, it goes through automatically with that host name. Now, vouchers are really cool. Vouchers are if, for example, you're running a coffee house and you go, hey, I want to hand out tickets. So only people with the ticket and a number can get in here. And the roll bits, ticket bits, checksum bits, this is the where you set the magic number. These are the allowable characters, and it will print something you can download right into, like, for example, OpenOffice, a CSV file, and hand out addresses. And as you hand out these numbers, they type in this number, and it gives them access for some predefined amount of time. You can say, hey, make each voucher worth 24 hours of internet access. So it creates this list of these, and you just check them off the list as they come through. They buy a coffee, you get a voucher, it's on the cup, there you go, you get your free internet access. That way you just can't hang out forever, and you set the expiration time for that voucher and tell them they got to buy another coffee before they get another voucher. And this is some of the more details for the file, where you can set and upload some of the captive portal options and like individual files that you want. Like if you have some images and go, maybe some explaining and a picture, however you want to customize it. DHCP server. It does have the option for each one of them. This is on my computer, my firewall, and our network. So we have LAN and LAN 2. I'm not real creative with the names. They're two separate networks, and they hand out two different ranges. So you can set all these options in here, all the different customizations you expect with DHCP, even changing over the default gateway that a device would get. You can also segment it out into pools. So you can set the first range, and then you create a pool of ranges. So you want them to have this range, and that range, and that's where all the pools as options. So you can create these unusual staggered blocks where they go, okay, I only want from 10 to 50, and I want another one to go from 100 to 120, and another block to go from 200 to 220, and it'll assign from those pools in there. And you can stagger them out however you want. This is something else we're using, is a TFTP server, because we have network booting enabled for our imaging server. So this allows us to put in a TFTP server and some of the information of what the default BIOS file it should pull is, and what the server name is, and pass over any root path strings or UEFI options that you may need. So this is kind of fun. When you have this, the DHCP server has to help, and this gives you all those little details, and it is fairly current because it supports UEFI 32 and 64-bit. We really haven't had too many problems with the type of server we're using. We didn't have to do any UEFI customizations. We're using Crucible, and it seems to work perfectly fine. Then at the bottom, you've got the options to have static IP and different options in there, like our printers, our Raspberry Pi, which you may have noticed is at 192.168.3.14. Haha. When you're adding a static mapping, you can click on copy MAC address, and it will copy your MAC address, and you can create all the options specifically for them. You can also just go from the menu page and pick any of the leases and assign them back to static and put it all in here. Even if you wanted to, if you have some special devices where you want a net boot file name for them and you want to customize how they boot off the network, for example, you can put this in here and put customization in. So even though we have a default TFTP server, that can be overridden specifically in here to offer that as an option, so it can boot off of its own TFTP. Here's a list of the static or the leases. It tells you if they're static, if they're not, if they're offline, which is basically whether or not it can see them. And like I said, you can just click the plus next to any of them and add them right to a static list. Pretty easy. DNS Resolver. This is by default the new DNS. They had the other one that they've deprecated but still leave in here, so there's some other options. You can also just do DNS forwarding, where the firewall has nothing to do with DNS, and it's just going to go out and use whatever DNS the ISP was signed on the WAN side. With the DNS forwarding, though, this gives you some options, with the DNS Resolver, this gives you some options, and with these options, you can do things like override whatever internal DNS. So you can say, hey, these other addresses should be statically assigned and automatically have this DNS name, so you don't have to rely on any type of protocols for name resolution. So you can call your servers whatever you want and assign them in here. You do that right down here. These are all the host overrides or domain overrides. You can say, no, this domain overrides to this and this host overrides to this. So it gives you different options on there. The domain override is pretty simple, and so they look kind of the same. So here's the DNS DNS Resolver edit host. This is where I can take my computer, give it a host name, it defaults to local domain, and add the IP address. It also lets you add additional ones in here, so I can have additional information where it's Tom or it's computer or Tom's computer, and I can make different variations of it. So whenever they try to look up that host, it doesn't jump out to the internet. It automatically overrides it and say, nope, that host is 192.168.1.9 internal. Domain override is pretty cool too. So you can go here and go to your DNS Resolver, edit domain override. Maybe you want to take your company website, and when they type it in internally, it redirects somewhere else. You could then set up a different IP address for the resolution that offers a different answer and then put that inside of here. Or if I've done this for testing purposes, when we're building a new website for a client, I just throw it in here real quick, the website, because their current website is live and we're working on a new one, but I'll change the DNS to resolve differently, and it will pull from that specific DNS server to give me the results of that domain. Kind of novel. And it's got a couple other, if you see at the top here, static DHCP or DHCP registration, and it's going to allow you to, as it gets assigned and DHCP recognizes the host name, it can add that into the list so it resolves automatically. So DHCP realizes the host name, assigns an IP address, it automatically adds a response. So when there's looking up a DNS query of a local host, it can also go, hey, that host has been registered via DHCP, and here's the response for that local host information. You can go through here and play with all the different settings and tweak it. I leave it all at default, but if you say default's not good enough for me, once again, the web interface has tons of options to play with and set. Everything from the buffer sizes, minimum TTLs, jostle timeout, all the stuff, and log level. So if you go, I need really high level 4 logging turned on, that is an option, so you can really get into DNS and figure out, what's in here, how quick you want the host cache to expire. If 15 minutes isn't good enough, you can change that to more or less. You can also create access lists, and that is for specific who can or can't access the DNS servers. By default, it's wide open. Anyone inside your network can access port 53 and access it, but you can create rules other than that. Dynamic DNS. If you're on a roaming DNS, they have quite a list of dynamic DNS support. Cloudflare, Custom, DNS-O-Matic, DNS, Easy DNS, Euro DNS, Free DNS. So that way, if your IP address is changing, you go, I need to have this address all the time. This can support updating it all the time for you, and it's got some custom options. So if yours isn't listed, you can pass parameters to whoever your dynamic DNS provider is and have it send up that information. That way, when your IP address changes, it automatically updates for you. I set one up just there. It tells you the cached IP, host name, and it had an option to put the password in. I'm just going to go ahead and, just for demonstration, to show that it works, and you can put it in there. Load balancing. This is kind of cool. This is not for load balancing your multiple WAN. That's the lag interface. This is so you can load balance, for example, HTTPS. So let's say I have a group of servers behind the firewall, and I have a whole lot of traffic coming through, and one server can't handle it. Well, let's let up load balancing, and that's some of the options. It also has failover, so if one of the servers becomes unresponsive, it will then switch over to another one. So there's a couple different options in here. I set it up as load balance mode, but like I said, it supports a few others. You choose the port, you choose the protocol, you can add the different ones to the enabled or extra ones to the pool. So you add all these over here, enable them, and now you have a load balancing built in here. It also tells you which ones are running, save, reset, so you can just check one out. So if you set it up and you go, hey, I need to take this one out of the pool, we're going to take it down for service, just click it, and then it'll leave it in the list. It's just not enabled. Click save again, and away you go. NTP Service, which is built in. By default, it goes to 0.pfSense.pool.ntp.org. You can set up multiple time servers in here. You can go wild with this and start doing all kinds of statistics on it. Access restriction, adjust for leap seconds, put in multiple, and it doesn't just take here. You keep it in the plus, and you can then create a whole pool of addresses that are in here. And you can see that it pulls it and gives you the information. By default, like I said, it's wide open on here. You can also, if you go, hey, this isn't good enough for reaching out to the internet, and I have this satellite that's going to look at the GPS satellite. It has a list of supported GPS plugins through the serial port or different interfaces. So you can plug in a GPS to this to use the time off these satellites in here, and it's got all kinds of customization for that. I thought that was pretty cool. And a couple more details on setting this up. PPOE Server. If you want this to act not as a PPOE client, but also a server, so you have a configuration that you want people logging into you, that's another option on here. So your WAN interface, and they can log in via PPOE for different connections and internet sharing. Don't really have a good use case for it, but it's an option. With Radius and NAS and some other information on there. No, not NAT, it's a network text storage, but it's a part of the Radius authentication. SNMP Client. So if you're using a monitoring system that is using SNMP to look at your different network devices, that is fully supported in here. It does by default use public, which is the most common for your public information for SNMP. So you can then use this to add this to your SNMP list. UPNP and NAT-PMP. So UPNP and NAT-PMP is the automatic protocol that allows things to map through your firewall. Good news is this is off by default. But if you're a home user and you go, I want things that automatically want firewall permissions to let them create their own rules and create their own pass-throughs. A lot of gaming devices do this, and some of the IoT devices will do this, where they can automatically punch to your firewall and create a rule that comes back through for gaming or for some type of access. That is an option on here. Some of the really basic security camera systems do this. They'll automatically do it. Good news is it logs. Good news is it's off by default, but you can enable it to make your life easier if you don't want to map port yourself. And then it has a logging to tell you what's on there. I have no UPnP devices, so I wasn't able to demo what it looks like, but it does tell you the rules that it builds when you're doing that. So it's pretty cool. On Lan. This is pretty neat. It's got an option to set wake-up calls that you can send across either the WAN or LAN interface to wake up devices. You can add a bunch of devices in here that you want to be able to wake up, and then hit send for an individual, or group them together and press W, and it'll wake them all up at once. Kind of neat that they built that in. And it lets you choose which interface you want that attached to. And that's the wake up all button. VPN IPSEC. I am not an IPSEC expert, but it does have this all built in. It's got the different WAN information that you can tie to. So when you go through all the configuration, it does not have a wizard, but it does allow you to go through, and if you're familiar with IPSEC, go through all the different options, set up all the keys, set up the remote gateway, the IP addresses, the different certificates, and put them all in together with some really good passwords. None of this is all made up stuff, so don't bother trying, and set up the encryption algorithms and all those little details. It does have the options for mobile clients, so you can put up some of the local information on there. Also, the user authentication, you can add more sources if you have more options in here. For example, outside of it, like Radius authentication or LDAP. But for user authentication, it defaults to the local database, because that's all we have set up in here. Then you can go through all the different advanced settings, logging levels, and some of those other fine-grained details, unique IDs, IP compression, strict interface binding. So you've got all the different customizations for IPSEC. So OpenVPN, this is the VPN of choice for me. It works great. It's new, it's current, it's very secure. It doesn't have many restrictions. It passes through firewalls well, and it's well supported in pfSense. So by default, of course, there's no server set up on here, no client specific anything. This will work as a server or a client. You can have more than one pfSense box, and the other one be the server, and this one be a client, so you can bridge two networks together via OpenVPN, and that works really well. The best way to set these up as far as for users is to start with the wizard. The type of server, local user access, there's nothing else in this pull down because we don't have anything else set up for besides local users for authentication. We're going to call it Demo VPN. Default key length is 2048. You have to create a certificate, is one of the first things it has you do. If you don't have one to import, you create one. Then you create a new server certificate. And then you choose where it lands. So OpenVPN server by default wants to use the WAN. It's a good idea, but you can set up internal VPNs to hide traffic inside from even one interface to another and build VPNs that way. Might be an odd use case, but it does support it. So we'll leave it at default at the WAN. Description of the VPN. Type of authentication, generate the TLS key automatically. You can put in if there's some shared key information, parameter length, encryption algorithms. Hardware crypto is supported well. If you have a supported chipset for hardware crypto, it does have that option on here. Then you set up the tunneling network. I set mine up as 70.0 as a network. The way OpenVPN works is that it creates a intermediary network between the two devices. So you have your external person and you have your internal, and we have a 192.168.3 network, but the 70 network is the in-between network we're setting up for this. So it creates an extra IP range /24, so we can have up to 254 users on this tunnel, and it creates a bridge between those. So it's going to have an internal and external assigned that they will negotiate, and then it does the routing table to allow the traffic to pass via routing through the 70 and back down to the client network on each side. That is how OpenVPN works. It doesn't default to working where it just adds another IP address onto your network. There is a way you can do that. I don't really recommend it. This way works great. Unless you really need to bridge the networks together or have it show up as an IP on your exact one. This also makes filtering really easy because anything routing to that address, you'll know, hey, that's part of the OpenVPN network that's coming in. Number of concurrent connections, redirected gateway, a local network. You may have to assign some of the endpoint ranges depending on the settings. So you can say, okay, when they're coming in, they're using this network, and then assign it, and it'll do a push for those. Number of concurrent connections. That way, if they're using the same username and password because you didn't want to create multiple users, or one user has multiple devices that VPN in, you can set up more than one concurrent connection from that one user. Dynamic IP, you can then have it assigned from the pool of IP ranges. This is for that 70 network where it just is going to add it, or you can statically assign each user. The default options are perfectly fine when you're running the wizard. You can literally next and yes your most all of this except for setting up the other one because it wants to know what your intermediary network is. You have to come up with something in there that is different than your other networks, and it should also be different than your clients are connecting to, because VPNs will have trouble routing. If you had exactly the same network on both sides, the computers get confused exactly how to do all the routing. Add a firewall rule and add an OpenVPN rule. These are real important, and if you do it without the wizard and you forget to do this, you will be beating your head against the wall going, the VPN connects but will pass no traffic. That's because if you don't have a rule that allows the VPN to communicate with your internal network, it can't. So everything's implicitly has to be set to do this. By default, this will create a wide open rule that you can edit. That way you can still use the wizard, create the rule, create the VPN, create the certificates, all this on the fly, and then let it create a wide open rule. Then you can go back and edit the rule before you enable all this, before you give it to your users. That way if you say, okay, I want the wizard, but I want the fine-grained control, you can go back and edit the firewall. And the same with the firewall rules. This is just to open up the port so on the WAN side so the people can pass through and come in. Once you're done, configuration complete, you click finish. And like I pointed out here, here's that OpenVPN rule, and you'll see by default it's *** all the way across. And it tells you it was created by the OpenVPN wizard, and you can edit this and modify rules or create a whole set of rules for the OpenVPN because you want it to be able to only see certain things on the network. By default, it opens it up wide open so everything can pass. And this is where I can specify a destination when you're at it. And it's the same firewall rules we showed before. So you can just type in specifically and go, that you can VPN in, but they can only see this box when they get in here, and you can set the one IP address. Or you can set an entire network so they can only see the option 1 network. See, when you say destination all, it lets them see any of the networks. And here on the WAN side, we're just opening up the port, and we're not opening it to a NAT destination. We're just opening it from the WAN address, destination WAN address, and that means that the OpenVPN is accessible from the WAN side on port 1194 from anywhere. But you can create restrictions. For example, if you're doing a site-to-site VPN and you have a static IP on the other end, you could say, I want to open this up, but create the firewall rules so the only source is that static IP. That way no one ever tries to knock on the VPN. As a matter of fact, they will see the port as closed. Client export. This is where that feature comes in. This is the plugin for the OpenVPN client export utility. Now this is pretty cool. At the bottom here you see all these little options. It's got, if you have some other options you want to change, but once again default's perfectly fine for all this. And at the bottom is where you download the different versions of the installer. Now this is what it looks like if you download just a zip file for Android or for Linux. It just does these basic CRT key and OpenVPN option, which is just the settings in there. It's just a text file. I haven't seen anything that automatically imports that. I think it does on Android. I haven't really tried. But the other ones on here are the OS installers for Windows. So x86 Windows XP, 64-bit XP, x86 Win 6, and x64 Win 6. Win 6 does cover all the way from Windows Vista 7, 8, and 10. I've tested all of them and it works great. I have not done as much Mac testing, but I have been told it works good. When you look at the key it embeds, it has the key on here and the information and the IP address. You know, this is my demo server, so the WAN address is 3.170, so all the information is here. This is if you just open up that OVPN file and you want to put the settings in. Also, when you're downloading these, like I said, everything becomes embedded. When you do it on Windows, it embeds automatically all the certificates into the one single executable that allows them just to next and yes the install. Also, I don't have a per user certificate. So if you had a per user, it will actually list out each user that has a certificate. So you have the certificate already rolled in that you created with OpenVPN, but then if you also did per user certificates, those would get rolled in and you would list out each username and would create an installer that installed all those features in there, including the user's certificate. So if you're really concerned about security, you want to do per user certificates, then you could do this, and then you would have the option to issue the certificates or do the certificate revocation. So not only would you delete the user, you can also revocate their certificates for security, and this helps take care of all that. System diagnostics. There is a lot of diagnostics you can do without dropping the command line. You can grab the ARP table authentication information. The authentication is kind of cool because if you don't know someone's password and they think what it is, it lets you test authentication. Kind of cool. System diagnostics. There's a whole list of diagnostic options that come through here. We're going to run through them. You can just display the ARP table so you can see what's on the network through ARP and see what it's seeing. The authentication option is kind of neat. By default, because we only have a local database set up, you can put a username and password and hit test. So people can say, I thought my VPN password was this. Obviously, we know we can reset it, but I can't see what their password was. You can go in here and say, no, that's clearly not your password. So it's a quick way to test it to make sure you got the password right. Execute a command and see the output. It's got a couple different options. You can just, without dropping the command line, push something to there or download a file based on if you know exactly what you want, or upload a file to the server without ever having to, SSH in or use SFTP to copy things back and forth. DNS lookup. You want to know what the DNS servers are responding and how they're seeing things for one host particular name. This is nice, so you can go, okay, the firewall's having a problem, a user can't see something, we can go query and put that information in here and run the output. If you don't like the way it edits the config.xml file, you can go through and hand edit it yourself. It's all just standard XML, so you can download, load, and save it. Not the way you want to do it, though. This is not how you're going to restore config.xml file, because it may not be reading from it when you're setting settings. But if you want to go through here and save it for whatever reason, you can go through here and tweak it. Reset factory defaults. Click yes, it'll reboot. It's clean. This is a scary option. It just says once, are you sure? You say yes, and it's gone. And I've unfortunately had some clients that wanted access to their firewall, and I've used this. That's why we always keep backups of their config.xml so we can just put it back together for them. Are you sure you want to halt the system? So instead of just rebooting, it does have a halt option that powers it off. Please don't do this remotely, or you'll be like, crap, I need someone to go back in there and turn that on. And then there's reboot, which, need to reboot system. Hit yes, it reboots. Different queue and details on the limiter info from the traffic shaping. Packet capture. If you need to capture some packets, it has that built in, so you can put in some of the address families, protocol, port, packet length, and count, level of detail, whether or not you want to reverse look it up, and grab some packet capture and download it. Diagnostics for smart monitor tools. So whatever devices you have in here that are hardware, such as hard drives, SSD, or spinning that have smart attributes, you can run tests and view the outputs of those or look at the logs. You can look at the routing tables. So if you have some custom routing, you're running multiple LAN interfaces with custom routing or VPNs in there, and you're just trying to figure out how things route, you have that option there to take a look at this. pfInfo, just dump all kinds of details about the packet info. pfTop. Show states. You can look at every state and what state it's in through the firewall and then reset them if you have to. So you can look at traffic passing back and forth, what ports it's on, what type of connections they are. If you're trying to find something, it offers filter options, and you can try and locate and figure out what's going on, maybe something establishing a connection. More diagnostic information here though. And you can just hit reset all the states, just whatever's going on, clear them all out and let them all reestablish. If you're doing VoIP calls, I will warn you that we'll probably drop the VoIP calls that are on there, or they may reestablish, but this is a way you can just clear it all out and start over. Then this is kind of a summary table for the state information. Port testing is kind of cool. So if you want to test a port from the firewall, so maybe you're remoting in and you want to see how the firewall sees something. I've used this when clients have somehow gotten blacklisted from a website due to something in their network, and then you can use this to see how it sees it. So you can go, well, it's up for me. Why isn't it up for you? And you can just go into the firewall through the web interface and see what the port responses are on there. If they have multiple WAN addresses, the source address, you can pull from each one of the IPs and see how each one of the IPs sees the response. And it's got all the options in there. This is diagnostics for trace route. So if you want to just trace route how things are routing through here, once again, set the number of hops, choose where the source is if you have multiple IPs on the WAN side, and it can trace route that out. System status. There's a lot of logging that goes on. So depending on the different level of detail for the options, does a pretty good amount of logging. There's usually some options to turn on more logging, for example, like we've seen with the firewall or with the or with Snort. You can see that you can go in deep with the firewall logs and keep a lot more information in here. It even will log the wireless, the portal authentication, IPSEC. And the VPN is actually, even though the IPSEC is a VPN, it also just manages the OpenVPN in there separate, and then it has another VPN option in there. It has like a general VPN. Gateway alarms. So if you have alarms set to the gateway to see whether or not there's anything like a delay or jitter, so if you're trying to track down problems, it will give you that information in there. Normal view is just the basic view, so you can look at all the source and click the I for reverse lookups. So if you're looking for some of the firewalls and what's going on, it can go through here. You can also filter out passed and blocked using regular expressions. It also gives you some interface summaries for interface data, protocol, source IPs, destination IPs, destination ports. Kind of cool, draws these on the fly. Then you have your RRD graphs for traffic, for the system load, for packets. They're all broke down to different date ranges, like a 3 months. So you can kind of look over time to see what bandwidth's being used, or if there's peak times bandwidth's being pulled. Backup and restore. This is pretty cool. So you can download the config, no problem. The restore gives you the option to restore granular. So you can say, I have a backup of how I had the firewall rules, but I changed a bunch of other settings, and I only need the firewall rules restored, but not the other settings I changed. When you're doing the restore, that's some of the options on there. You can also encrypt the backups, so the backups don't have anything in clear. Now, it does back up all the VPN information, so do keep this secure. So someone could access, if they had your backup, they could reset up your VPN and emulate it, because all the certificates, everything gets wrapped up in there. So you may want to put a password on that. And by default, it does not want to back up the RRD data, but if you wanted that to be restored, it can consume quite a bit of space inside there and make a very large file, but it will. That way, when you restore your firewall, you don't lose that history through the RRD. When you're doing the backups, that's granular as well. You can say only backup one feature. This is kind of cool because if you built a traffic shaper and you really spent some time customizing all the options in there, you could restore the traffic shaper on another system to say that's how I want the traffic shaper to be without having to do all the detail work. And you don't want to mess with the settings because they're two different firewalls, but you want these two things to be the same. You can also do it with Package Manager. If you have a list of common packages, you can download the common packages and then upload them to another one, and then it will go through and install that package information. And here's the fine grain restore. Now, this is where it's really cool too. The configuration history is also very fine-grained. So this keeps, by default, 30 full or 5 on the Nano BSD, which was the flash drive install, copies. And it lets you do diff. It tells you what changes were made to an extent. If you make some of the simple ones, it just says, like, I edited DHCP, but it doesn't give you the detail of what I changed. But that allows you to revert by clicking the plus. And it does have a confirmation prompt. If you clicked it, it says, are you sure you want to do this? Then there's delete. You can just delete this configuration option or download this version. So you can download the previous versions of the config. I think that's really nice because that way you're customizing it. Not only can you fine grain restore, but you go, you know what, I want the backup because I've somehow messed things up so bad. I want to get the backup from a week ago. You can go and download a previous version of the config as it was before you started changing things. And then you can go through the diff, and it will actually diff the XML file when you select two different ones up and down these rows over here, and you can get a difference between the backups, so you can look at the XML file in the raw on the screen and go, oh, that's what was changed. This setting's different than that one, and it highlights the differences between the two. Command line interface. Yes, you can log into the command line, and this is what the console looks like. By default, it's not password protected. You can password protect it. But I always figure if you've gotten this far and you have physical access to my console, you've probably dug in deep. And you have physical access, so why do I want a password in there? Also, if you put a password on it and you forget the password and you want to reset things, you can't get into this, reset it, you end up having to reload the firewall, which is a real pain in the butt. So here's the interface, and you can go through and reset the interfaces anytime. I've had to use the assign interface. We had one of them get hit by lightning. It burned down an interface. We swapped it. It then did not know where that belonged for the LAN, so it had to run through and set this. Nice thing is all the rules followed. Once you assign interfaces, all the configuration we had attached to that just copied with it once we replaced the broken network card in it. It also allows you to update the firmware. You can upload from here or upload from a local file, so you can do updates from the command line by copying them over to the computer and then update from a local file or just queue for quit. You can dump real-time log information and let it scroll across the screen. So if you have the console, you want to look at it and just have that scrolling across, you can. Build or buy. Now, if you're buying these, they're really not that expensive at $299 for the amount of features you get in this firewall, and you want to put it in an office environment and you go, I want no moving parts, I want a really solid device that's using solid state. They default, these ones use flash with the Nano BSD in them. For $299, it's hard to beat this quality of firewall. They're using Netgate hardware, and you can find these used. I found them used for about $79 for slightly older models on eBay. So you can build these for pretty cheap out of an old computer, but if you want a really solid platform that you go, you know, I'm going to install this in a business office and I don't want any moving parts, I want something low wattage, and it doesn't really have a console except for a basic console interface because there's no VGA in these. They're really hard to beat for $299. As you need features or you go, I need like 20 VPN users, they scale up and sell much larger boxes. This one has 4 interfaces on it, you know, LAN, WAN, option 1, option 2. And you can also choose Wi-Fi options on these. They can get Wi-Fi cards in them. I've never found any of these Wi-Fi cards that come with them to be all that great. I've not tested all of them, but they work pretty good. Like I said, you can just build these yourself out of any old computer, and for home that's fine, where you're going, hey, I can just take an old system and use it. There's not a lot of horsepower required. These are built with Atom boards. And that's it. Thank you very much.